doing a pull workout today, similar to the one that we did last time, where I'm going to be doing lat pull down. I think I'm going to switch it up, and I'm going to do a bit of dumbbell rows today, and then also a chest supported machine row. And then we'll do some rear delts and then finish off with some biceps. I'm starting with lat pull downs. It's pretty much a staple. You can use cable. I actually really like this machine because, like I've mentioned before, the resistance profile of it allows me to generate a lot more force in my lats, because this machine, because it uses a cam, it's actually going to be heavier in that sort of lengthened and mid-range. And then as I fully contract my lats and bring those handles close to my chest, the movement actually gets a little bit easier. Whereas on a regular cable lat pull down, generally most people say you feel a more consistent or constant tension through the whole range of movement, but the vast majority of the time it tends to be heavier as you bring that bar closer to your chest, just based off of biomechanics and also sometimes how the pulleys work. So this offers just a slightly different resistance profile, again, making it harder or heavier in that lengthened and mid-range. And then as I bring those handles closer, the movement does get a bit easier. So I'm able to overload the lats or my back muscles a little bit more than I would if I was doing just a regular cable lat pull down. But again, I mean, I'm not trying to be too pedantic. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. It doesn't really matter as what you start with, as long as you're executing the movement properly with good form. So I've already done 3 warm-up sets here. For warm-ups, I'll typically do 1 to 2, sometimes 3, sometimes even 4, depending on how I'm feeling. I'm still kind of getting over being sick, so my body still a little bit weaker, and it's also kind of cold outside. So I'm just doing that to literally warm up. But we're going to start our first working set now, and I might do about 4, maybe 5 sets, because I like this movement so much. Rep range, last thing I'm going to say is the rep range. We're going for pretty high rep range today. I find that's just been working really well for me. So I'm going to aim for about 15, maybe even close to 20. Again, trying to get or push as close to failure, or at least 1 to 2 reps shy of failure, pretty much on every single set. And again, we're going to pyramid up in weight. That was about 20 reps. I'm going to increase the weight a bit. Even though I did kind of go to failure for that, included partials towards the end, because again, I mean, include partials whenever you get the chance. But again, with this machine, like I've already said, because of the strength or resistance profile of it, by doing those lengthened partials, you actually get a ton of stimulus because it's heavier in that range. So my whole goal for pretty much every exercise that you'll see today, a few things I'm thinking about: creating that stability, but really working in that full range. So getting a deep, deep stretch in the back, as deep as possible. So I'm coming up the full way, fully stretching, feeling my shoulder blades almost move away from my midline of my back, pulling up, getting that full stretch. And then as I drive down, I'm thinking about driving my shoulders and elbows down towards the ground or towards my hips, maintaining that upright or even arched posture. Because again, my goal is to target the lats a little bit more than my upper back. But again, I'm still going to be working upper back a bit, but just trying to hit those lower lats. Thought I was gonna keep rolling. It was like the those memes of when you drop something at like 3 in the morning in the kitchen and it just bounces literally all over the place. Let's do our third set. Take a little longer rest. Again, I think rest time is more so preference. Not to be too nerdy, but there are some studies that show that a little longer rest is actually more beneficial. If you get into like the 30-second or a minute, it might not be enough time. So letting your body recover, letting your heart rate kind of come down a bit can really make a difference in terms of force output and actually quality of the actual reps or quality of the set. So probably about 2 to 4 minutes. All right, third set. We did go heavier. So again, still trying to hit that 15 rep range or close to it, but going to failure. Hey. Oh. We're gonna do probably one more set. I might do 5. See how this last set goes. Again, I'm still kind of recovering. One thing I'm thinking about, especially as the weight gets heavier, is really keeping my hips against this seat the entire time. So I'm using a lot of leg drive, driving my knees or my quads into this pad to keep me down and anchored the entire time. Because again, my biggest thing is stability. Keeping my hips stable and locked in position will allow me to create a lot more force and tension on the actual lats, because the lats actually do insert at the top of the hip. So if I can keep this stable, I just have more of an opportunity for greater tension and force output. So keeping the hips down is crucial for this. Minimizing as much momentum as possible. Obviously, you don't have to be so rigid. You can move through the movement 100%. You can do cheat reps, but control the movement, control the eccentric, and you'll make just a lot more progress than just willy-nilly flying through the movement, moving from A to B. So you'll see here, I'm gonna keep my hips down on this seat the entire time. And I'm really just focused on driving all that tension through my lat, driving my shoulders and elbows down to the ground. A little bit of leaning back is completely fine. Oh shit. All right, we're gonna do one more. We'll keep the same weight. I'm gonna try to push the reps a little bit further if I get one or two more. But again, like I said, keeping those hips down. Last thing, another tip too, is I have mentioned this in the past, is as I'm pulling down, I want my wrist and elbow to be stacked and go in the trajectory of the ground, or in the direction of the machine. What can happen when people try to muscle through this is their elbows will start to kick back like this, and they'll start to round their shoulders forward, which one, eliminates any sort of tension on the lat, but places an unnecessary amount of force and tension on the shoulder joint, which isn't worth it, and you run the risk of injury. So again, keeping those wrists and elbows stacked, I'm almost tucking in, again, engaging some of that lat before I even get the movement going, and then driving elbow and shoulder down to the ground, not kicking back like this and rounding forward. All right, fifth and final set, and then we're gonna move on. Oh, shit. All right, we're gonna move on to some dumbbell rows. We're just gonna use this. done 2 sets, 1 warm-up, roughly, just to kind of gauge how I'm feeling. 1 working. We'll do about 3, maybe 4 sets on each side. The warm-up, you may have seen me use a different bench to lean on. It was just a bit too high, so I went with the incline. I set it pretty low on a slight incline, just enough to keep me elevated a bit. I like my torso, not necessarily horizontal with the ground. It can be, parallel with the ground. But depending on where you angle your torso is going to dictate which part of your back you want to hit. So obviously, the more parallel with the ground, the more to that middle portion of your back you're going to be targeting, or your lat. Whereas the higher, the greater degree of the angle of your torso is going to kind of target a bit more of those upper back muscles, your traps, rhomboids, things like that, a little more than just the lat. So for me, I like a little bit of in between. Hit the lat, but also hit the lat by keeping my elbow tucked, but also elevating my torso a little bit to hit more of those upper back muscles. I'm going to do another set, and then I'll walk you through my stance and my form in terms of how I actually execute this movement and why. All right, so a few things I'm thinking about when I'm performing these is, first and foremost, a lot of people online have given me shit many times for having my leg on the working side forward. And the reason I have that, like I've explained in some of my videos, is it offers greater stability in the movement. Now you might say, well, why don't you just do it on an incline bench? Because 1, I want to do single arm, and 2, I find I have much more leverage, or greater leverage, being in this standing position, with still trying to minimize that momentum in the movement. So I'm keeping the leg on my working side forward. This is going to offer the greatest amount of stability because it's going to be directly over top of my center mass. Whereas if I'm like this and I'm working on this side, I don't have anything to really stabilize. I'm going to be having to use a lot more core on this side to keep myself from twisting. But more often than not, people tend to just twist and then yank this up. So they do more of almost like an oblique twist to get the movement going, when in reality, if they just switch feet, you may think this leg is in the way, but in reality, you just need to be working in this plane of motion. I don't need to necessarily swing across like this. So it's just gonna offer more stability in the movement. I'm positioning myself over top of that leg, so I'm almost keeping my sternum somewhat in line with my knee, or maybe even my toe. And then as I row, well, 1, I'm driving this opposite hand into the bench, locking it into place. As I row, trying my best to point that bicep forward to keep that elbow close to my body the entire time. If my elbow drifts out, it's not a big deal, but the further your elbow drifts away from you, the more upper back and less lat you're going to be targeting, more rear delt you'll hit. And for this, I don't really want to hit that yet. And then, yeah, the whole goal is just to minimize any sort of twisting or rotation in the movement. So I'll show you here. Now my torso is going to be a little more upright as opposed to parallel with the ground, because again, I'm intentionally trying to target a bit higher up on the lats, but also a bit more upper back. Arching that back, keeping that chest out, protracting, so I'm not twisting, but I'm protracting, creating that length in my back muscles and my lat, and then driving that shoulder and elbow down towards my hips. The joy of doing heavy, well, for me, heavy dumbbell rows, single arm, is you got to do the other side when you're tired. So I give myself, again, a little bit more rest, let my heart rate come down, just so I can ensure that I'm getting quality reps on the other side as well. Okay. Do one more set. We'll go a little bit heavier. Okay, we got one more set. We're gonna go a little heavier. Now, what I mentioned before too about minimizing the twisting rotation or momentum. Some of you might be like, well, I tend to twist, but I also feel a greater contraction when I twist. And I'd argue that you're probably not feeling more of a contraction in your lat, and it's actually probably more so giving you the illusion that you're feeling a deeper contraction, but it's actually probably coming more so from your core or obliques. The reason being is because mechanically, the lat doesn't actually do much twisting or rotation at the spine. So one thing I want you to think about, without getting too nitpicky, but understand the biomechanics of the lat and where it originates and where it inserts. So if the lat inserts up here on my humerus or my upper part of my arm, and then it also attaches down the mid part of my back, all the way down my spine, and then into my hip, my whole goal is to bring this point here of the insertion as close to the origin as possible. By me rotating is not facilitating any more degree of contraction, or in other words, bringing this part of my arm closer to my spine. I'm just using all these core muscles in my obliques to do that movement and twisting. So thinking about bringing this point and this point of my back as close together as possible, instead of twisting or rotating, I want to think about actually rotating my arm around my back. So I'm almost thinking about wrapping my elbow around my back, bringing that as close to my spine as possible. I know I'm not going to be able to, but that's kind of something I want you to think about when you're performing this dumbbell row, or pretty much any row. Doesn't matter if you're using both arms. You're thinking about pulling those elbows and bringing them around your back as hard as possible. That's going to facilitate the deepest possible contraction in your lat and allow you to get the most out of the actual movement. Okay, that was it of this movement. We're going to move on to a chest supported machine row. So I'll show you my setup there. We're going to do something a little different, slightly. Yeah, it'll be good. And then we got rear delts and then some biceps. All right, so I was going to do a seated horizontal row, but I'll do that after because it was taken. But this actually works better because, like I did last time on my back workout, because we did a lat pull down working more in this plane, and then we did a dumbbell row, but it's actually more in line with like a machine low row because my torso angle. This is actually a perfect transition to working more of a high row in this sort of angle here, from a high to low, targeting primarily those lower lats. So again, 3 sets here to failure, keeping that elbow tight and making sure that I'm actually shifting my body position over to one side of this machine, because this machine diverges, meaning it gets narrow and then wider towards that end range. I want to try to keep my working arm in line with that path of the machine the entire time. So I'm actually shifting my body weight over to align it better with the actual machine, keep my lat with tension the entire time. So 3 sets. We're gonna do set number 2. So I'm doing single arm and using my opposing arm as a counterweight to keep my chest back and keep myself stable the entire time. So again, shifting that body weight over, keeping this lat and this working arm aligned with the machine and the path of that machine, and then driving that elbow and shoulder down towards the ground. think a good rule of thumb, like I was talking about, working in the different planes, the lat, machine lat pull down, primarily you're working in more of what's called a frontal plane. And then with something like a dumbbell row or rowing in front in this plane of motion, it's more of a sagittal plane. So again, it's a little nerdy, you don't have to know that, but I think something valuable to think about when you're structuring or doing exercise selection for your actual workouts is try to hit at least one exercise in each plane of motion. Well, two maybe if you want to think about rowing wider and then, you know, rowing more narrow. So a wide, a narrow, and then you could do like a wide and then even a narrow. But again, this is still working in that sagittal plane. But you don't have to necessarily do that for every single back exercise or every single back workout, but it's just something to keep in mind when you're structuring it. You can even split it up. You can do some back days you're strictly working primarily in a sagittal plane, and then others you're hitting a bit more in that frontal plane. But I think keeping that in mind and you know, selecting exercises accordingly will allow you to kind of hit the back from multiple angles and different planes. You get the most results that way. So third and final set on this one. Again, keeping that elbow tucked and being as rigid and stiff, or sorry, as stable in my hips as possible. No twisting or moving around, just keeping all that tension on that lat and that lower lat. Full stretch, and then driving that elbow and shoulder down. Okay. All right, we're gonna move on. We're just gonna do 2 sets here because this will be a nice segue into actually doing more of an isolated rear delt. What I'm doing here is I lower the seat a bit to keep my hands a little higher up as I row in, but I'm also flaring outward because my whole goal is to target primarily a bit more rear delt and more of those upper traps and rhomboids as well. So lower the seat, brought this chest pad out. I'm going for a full stretch and reach. And then as I pull back, I'm driving my sternum into this pad, but hyperextending my back, almost leaning back more to get my lats out of the movement. And again, place more of that emphasis on that rear delt. We're gonna do one more set, and then we'll move on to some rear delts and then finish off with some biceps. One thing I want you guys to think about when you're training back is to really accentuate, or sorry, exaggerate even, the stretch, opening up your back, really reaching through every movement, almost even rounding your back sometimes is okay, in your upper back, just to ensure that you're fully stretching those muscles in your back. Because oftentimes, for the most part, people tend to stay in that mid range and they never open up. They just kind of move their arms forward to here, and they miss this whole portion of the actual exercise, and all this range gets left behind because they're stuck in this rigid and fixed position, primarily because you're just stronger in this position here. You're pretty weak. Your muscles in general are pretty weak in the extreme. So the more lengthened or stretched the muscle becomes, the weaker it is, and the more shortened the muscle becomes, again, the weaker it gets. So people tend to hover primarily in that mid range where they're stronger, which is something to be cognizant about. Think about that when you're training your back, or any muscle group for that matter, but really open up your shoulder blades, open up that back, get that stretch, get that length, and then keep that rigid torso, keep those hips stable, and then just drive everything back. Lastly, the further your elbows move behind you, generally in any movement, the more rear delt you're going to be targeting. So if your goal primarily is to just hit the lats, then maybe, you know, you could stop somewhere around here, keeping that upper arm in line with your torso. But again, if you don't really care about that and you just want to get the most out of the movement and target your rear delts, especially if you have underdeveloped your rear delts, then focus on driving those elbows as far back as possible, especially if you're doing a wider row. Last set. Because I'm hyperextending as I pull, I am going to be working a bit more spinal erectors, so my lower back will start to fire more. But that's fine, because that actually is kind of my goal as well. So that is intentional, is to lean back. Again, controlling that eccentric into that full stretch.
Good morning. Good afternoon, good night.
All right, we're gonna move on to some rear delts. All right, we're gonna do 3 sets here, high reps. My main focus, you know what, I'll do a set and I'll tell you what I'm gonna do. So as you may notice, I'm leaning into this machine. This is just gonna allow me to be a bit more stable, but kind of keeps it better aligned with my rear delts and a little bit less trap. Because I'm leaning forward, I'm working from more of a high to low positioning as opposed to just horizontal. Again, at the end of the day, does it really matter? No, it's just depending on what your goals are, what you want to target, and if it honestly feels good for you. So I find leaning into it offers a bit more stability, gets my traps a little bit out of it, and allows me to isolate my rear delts more. Again, we're working in kind of a 15 to 20 rep range, stopping a couple reps shy of failure, but again, still including those partial reps, but controlled partials, not just bouncing in the movement. And that's pretty much it. As I'm thinking about executing every rep, I'm protracting forward, so I'm creating that length in my shoulders, opening up my scapulas, because I don't really want to initiate all the movement in my scapula. I'm okay with a little bit of retraction, but again, I'm trying to somewhat minimize that movement to keep or place most of that tension on the rear delt, because the rear delt attaches at that scapula. If you move it around too much, sometimes those bigger muscles in your back, like your rhomboids and traps and stuff, can take over. But again, as long as you're getting good stimulus, as long as you feel essentially a pump, it's usually a good indicator that you are working the target muscle properly. But just controlling every rep, controlling that eccentric is huge for these. As I'm opening, I'm actually thinking about opening out in a way. I'm not just pulling back like this. So I'm extending, or pushing rather, protracting my arms forward, like I said, and then pushing my hands out, almost like I'm trying to reach out to the walls beside me and touch them. We're gonna move on to some biceps, and then that's gonna be it. We'll do 2 exercises for bis, probably 2 to 3 sets each, starting with more of a lengthened exercise. Well, both are gonna kind of target the biceps, but from different angles in more of a lengthened state. We're gonna do a seated incline dumbbell, and then we're gonna go into a machine preacher curl. All the benches were taken. So we're starting with the machine preacher. The great thing about this one here is I can actually adjust the resistance profile of it. I'm keeping it at 1, which is basically just targeting the mid-range. So this is just going to be primarily no different than if I were to do it on with a free weight or a dumbbell. So most of that tension is going to be right around here, and then as I come up, it's going to get a little bit lighter towards that end range, which is good because I'm going to be stronger in this range anyway, so I can overload that muscle a lot more. And because I'm targeting primarily at the bottom and my arm is elevated, it is going to be working more of that beginning range here. We're going to go for about 15 to 20 reps again, still keeping that same idea of hitting each set as close to failure as possible, or at least 1 to 2 reps shy. My goal with this as well is, again, stability is key. So I'm driving my arms into this pad to initiate every single rep. I'm not just thinking about pulling my hands towards me or up, because if I think of that, you tend to more likely do something like this, where you're here and then you're using that momentum and your elbows start to elevate off the pad because you're just thinking about, I gotta lift this up. So instead of up, think about driving, pulling your arms down into that pad the entire time to initiate that rep, And then as you curl in, you're thinking about bringing your forearms to your biceps, keeping my elbow aligned with this axis of rotation here the entire time. That's just going to better align the joint with the actual movement or path of the machine. And then lastly, I'm keeping, because this is a hinge joint, I'm not flaring my elbows like this and doing some weird curling motion like this. That's going to place more stress potentially or shear force on that actual joint. So because this joint moves in one direction, I want to make sure that this joint is aligned in the direction of the actual machine. So I'm pointing my biceps forward the entire time. I'm not keeping them in like this and then just gripping the handles. So really pointing them forward and then scooping those handles up, or rather towards me, bringing my forearms to my biceps. You do a drop set. One more set. One more drop. Get the most out of it. Boom. Finish off over here. So we'll use this machine here just because the benches are kind of busy, the dumbbell rack's busy. Okay, I lied. We're not going to be using the machine over there. We're going to work, this is what I wanted to do originally, just a slight incline, so leaning back, dumbbell curl. The reason being is I want to fully stretch out my bicep. So I want to train the bicep when they're more in a lengthened state. So what that means is, depending on where my arm position is going to dictate whether my bicep is going to be more shortened or more lengthened. So if I bring my arm behind my body, that's going to fully lengthen the bicep. And the opposite is true. If I bring my arm all the way up and curl in, that's going to fully shorten the bicep. So why that matters, it's not a big deal, but it's just something to think about. Just like with your back, you want to hit it from different angles. And I think it's good to hit the bicep from different angles or different extremes. Just to build up strength in those ranges and also get the most out of the movement. So having that in mind can allow you to kind of select exercises depending on what you want to target and help you further hit those muscles from different angles. You don't want the bench to be too far back. If it's too far back, it can place a lot more stress on your shoulder. So just because I can have my arm way back behind me doesn't actually mean that's going to be beneficial for my shoulder. My shoulder might get a lot more tension or unnecessary tension in the front here, and it might be more uncomfortable. So I'd rather just have this bench set up in a position that allows me to have my arms slightly behind me. It's more comfortable on my shoulders, but also it allows me to keep this part of my upper arm. Like I've mentioned many times, when you're doing free weights, you want to make sure that your upper part of your arm, or rather your bicep, is perpendicular with the ground, because again, if we're using free weights, we're dealing with gravity. Gravity only moves in one direction, which is down. So I want to make sure that this upper part of my arm, or my bicep, is aligned with that line of force, which is gravity. So I'm going to be doing single arm on this. I might slightly lean out to one side. Again, this is just going to make sure that my arm is perpendicular with the ground, because sometimes if I am upright, naturally my arm wants to flare out slightly. So again, because this is a hinge joint, I want that joint to also be aligned with that line of force, or else it can cause what's called shear force. So it could potentially, not necessarily, but you run the risk of injuring or putting a lot more strain on your elbow joint. So it's just something to keep in mind. If your arms do naturally flare out and it's more restrictive to keep them tucked like this, then just slightly lean to one side and do one arm at a time, focusing on that one arm. 3 sets here. Again, going to failure or close to failure. Okay, I'm gonna do 2 more sets. My camera's gonna die. One thing I wanna say is that hopefully you learned something from this workout. We did our back, our lats, upper back, our rear delts, and our biceps. Now, this isn't the be all or end all. I'm not here to tell you that this is the only way to train, but this is just something this is just things that I think about when I'm executing movements. So hopefully you learned something from that. Again, I'm new to this whole YouTube thing, so this isn't the only way. This is just the way that I like to execute my workouts. So thank you so much for following along, and we'll see you next on a push day.